Headquarters Marshal in Nairobi. U.S. President Donald Trump has concluded his state visit to China and departed Beijing. During the visit, the heads of state of the two countries had in-depth exchanges of views on major issues concerning their respective countries and the world, and reached a series of new consensus. The two heads of state agreed to build a constructive China-U.S. relationship of strategic stability, providing strategic guidance for China-U.S. relations over the next 3 years and beyond, promoting the stable, health and sustainable development of bilateral relations, and bringing more peace, prosperity and progress to the world. The two heads of state also reached important common understandings on properly handling each other's concerns and agreed to enhance communication and coordination on international and regional issues. The Chinese Foreign Ministry says President Xi Jinping and U.S. President Donald Trump have had an in-depth exchange of views on major issues concerning their countries and the world and have reached a series of new common understandings. The Foreign Ministry today said the two leaders agreed on a new vision of building a constructive China-U.S. relationship of strategic stability. This will provide strategic guidance for bilateral ties over the next 3 years and beyond. The new vision will also promote the steady, sound and sustainable development of bilateral relations and bring more peace, prosperity and progress to the world. Beijing also says President Xi and Trump agreed to strengthen communication and coordination on international and regional issues. Meanwhile, the leaders also held a private meeting. Here's more now on Trump's visit to China.
President Xi Jinping has called Donald Trump's visit a historic and landmark one. He said the two sides have set a new vision of building a constructive China-U.S. relationship of strategic stability. She said the two sides have reached important common understandings on maintaining stable economic and trade ties, expanding practical cooperation in various fields, and properly addressing each other's concerns. She said President Trump's visit is conducive to enhancing mutual understanding, deepening mutual trust, and improving the well-being of the two peoples. He added that the visit once again demonstrates that it is a shared aspiration of both peoples and expectations of people across the world for China and the United States to find the right path to get along with each other and to achieve peaceful coexistence and win-win cooperation on the basis of mutual respect. The Chinese president also said that while President Donald Trump hopes to make America great again, he's dedicated to leading the Chinese people toward national rejuvenation. President Xi stressed that the two countries can advance their respective development and revitalization by strengthening cooperation. He also said China and the United States should implement the important common understandings that have been reached, cherish the hard-won positive momentum, keep to the right direction, steer clear of disruptions and promote the steady development of bilateral relations. U.S. President Trump said he's willing to continue maintaining sincere and in-depth communication with Chinese President. He thanked President Xi Jinping for inviting him to visit Zhongnanhai and said his trip has been successful and unforgettable. Trump also said he looks forward to hosting President Xi Jinping in Washington. The two sides have agreed to strengthen communication and coordination on international and regional issues.
Well, let's now get the latest from Beijing. Our reporter Yang Chengxi joins us live for more. So what was on the agenda of the final day of Trump's state visit?
Hi there, Beatrice. Now, before President Donald Trump departed from Beijing, him and President Xi Jinping have held a small-scale meeting earlier today, and President Xi made some remarks. And I think three of the most important takeaways are these. Now, first of all, it is that both leaders have reached a consensus to build a constructive China-U.S. relations of strategic stability, and that both sides have adhered to the principle of mutual respect, peaceful coexistence, and win-win cooperation. And last but not least, President Xi reiterated that the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation and making America great again can advance in parallel, and that it can benefit the world. Now, this is President Xi also said something like this during the state banquet last night. So clearly aiming to find a lot of common grounds between the two countries. Now, on the other hand, President Donald Trump said that the summit has been a great success and many consensus and deals have been reached. Now, we are yet to see any official release from both countries about the specific economic and trade outcomes coming out of this three-day state visit, but we'll keep you posted.
Well, Chang-Shi, what key recommendations came out of President Xi and Trump's meetings?
Well, I guess the biggest outcome coming out of this state visit is that both sides have reached a consensus of building a constructive strategic stability. Now, we've said this on the program many times, but this is indeed the most important outcome, a diplomatic one, coming out of this state visit, because it will be a guiding philosophy for the relationship of the two countries in the next 3 years and beyond. It will be the starting point from which two sides approach many of their competitions and differences, from tariffs to the tech competition to many other differences that might arise in the future. So this is going to be very important. Now, apart from this diplomatic outcome, we are still waiting for specific concrete results from on the trade and investment sides, but some companies have already released the results of their own discussions. For example, the Bank of China have announced yesterday that it held a discussion with the U.S. Soybean Export Council, and that both sides have signed a memorandum of cooperation between the bank's New York branch and the council. Now, note that soybean trade has been one of the focal points of the two countries' trade policies in the past few years. So this is going to be a very important development. And both the bank and the council said that the successful heads of state meeting have injected fresh momentum into both countries' economic and trade relations. Now, over the past few days, senior U.S. officials have been talking to American-based media outlets, talking about potential outcomes in, for example, AI chips, Boeing purchases, and agricultural trade. But these are still unconfirmed from official press release sources, and we'll keep an eye on that.
All right, Yang Cheng-Shi joining us there from Beijing. Thank you. Well, let's discuss this further. Professor Christopher Afoke-Isike, President of the African Association of Political Science and Professor of African Politics and International Relations at the University of Pretoria in South Africa, is joining us via Zoom. Professor Isike, U.S. President Trump just concluded and departed China after his state visit to Beijing, holding talks with Chinese President Xi Jinping. How significant and relevant was this meeting?
Well, thank you for having me. I just need to clarify that I'm no longer president of the African Association of Political Science. My term ended in December, so just put that out there. To your question, this is a very it's significant actually for both countries. Because I think it is strategically important because it attempts to redefine great power, competition away from outright confrontation and towards something that the Chinese now call constructive strategic stability, which kind of tells us that the relationship between the both countries is now dictated more by China than by the U.S. But it's also important to understand this not necessarily as a breakthrough summit where all problems are solved in one go, but rather as a strategic, stabilization summit between rival superpowers that are managing a dangerous transition in a changing, world, and we can actually unpack the significance in a number of broader realities. So, for example, like I said, it confirms that the U.S.-China relations are now the central axis of global politics. Is clear. We can even talk now about a bipolar world order, a G2. It's also reflected the emergence of a more contested post-unipolar order, like I said earlier on, and then also it demonstrated mutual economic dependence despite, the geopolitical rivalry between both countries. And you can see how trade was central for both countries, but the summit ended in a way that helped them to manage their differences, even though these differences are acknowledged.
Right. So President Xi Jinping outlined 4 dimensions for the relations. He emphasized cooperation and mutual benefit. What is your understanding of this framework and how would it work?
Well, the dimensions are positive stability with cooperation as the mainstay. The second one, sound stability with moderate competition. The third is constant stability with manageable differences, therefore acknowledging the differences between both countries. And then the last is the enduring stability that promises peace between both countries. Now, this framework is essentially China's attempt to institutionalize a managed rivalry with the United States. What it does is to acknowledge that competition is unavoidable, but argues that competition can be bounded, predictable, and non-catastrophic. So there are each of them. I don't know how much time you have, but each of them mean different things. But they are a staggered process towards an end. A result of stable peace globally, marked by bounded competition, like I said. So, for example, if you take the positive stability with cooperation as its mainstay, it is proposing that despite the strategic rivalry between both countries, cooperation should remain the foundation of the relationship in areas where their interests overlap. And there are many of those interests. How it will work in practice. So if you look at areas of cooperation like in global financial stability, issues around climate change, AI governance, pandemic preparedness, these are some of the areas where there can be cooperation between the two countries. The Iran crisis, for example, which Trump indicated he talked about, and the Strait of Hormuz, became immediate examples of where Washington needed Beijing's cooperation because China has some leverage over Tehran. So both countries would benefit from avoiding collapse in global supply chains and in managing, strategic issues like the Strait of Hormuz.
Right. All right. Professor Christopher Afoke Isike joining us there from Pretoria. Thank you. Well, that is it for this edition of The World Today. I'll be back shortly with more news from the continent in Africa Live. Thanks for watching. Africa CDC confirms new Ebola outbreak in DR Congo. Somalia humanitarian situation worsening as parts of the country face famine risk. And leaders push for investment in climate mobility solutions in West and Central Africa. I'm Beatrice Marshall in Nairobi. Welcome to Africa Live. Also ahead on the program. In business news, the Africa CEO Forum is in its second day in Kigali with calls for a stronger approach to protecting the continent's interests. And in sports, we'll have the latest from the World Squash Championships from Egypt's Giza. We begin in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where the Africa Centers for Disease Control and Prevention says a new Ebola outbreak in the northeast has killed 65 people and infected 246 others. Early tests have detected the virus in 13 of 20 samples, with sequencing underway to determine the strain. 4 deaths were among laboratory-confirmed cases in Ituri province, while suspected infections have been reported in Bunia, the capital of Ituri province. The Africa CDC has raised concerns over a possible spread of a virus across borders. Regional health officials are convening an urgent meeting today to coordinate a response. A U.S. defense agency has sounded the alarm over the rise of terror-related activity in Africa, saying it could have major consequences for global terrorism. General Doug Anderson, the head of the United States Africa Command, or AFRICOM, pointed to the Sahel region in particular. In recent weeks, various armed groups have been coordinating their activities to create chaos in Mali. Anderson said control of a capital city could give organizations like Al-Qaeda all the trappings of a nation-state to sponsor global terrorism. Here's CGTN Sofia Shimechero with more.
Addressing a Senate Armed Services Committee in Washington on Thursday,
the epicenter of global terrorism,
General Doug Anderson warned that extremist groups have expanded their operation capacity in Africa, particularly across the Sahel, a semi-arid region just to the south of the Sahara Desert. Last month, Mali was hit by a highly coordinated wave of assaults targeting several cities and military installations, including the capital Bamako. The offensive was carried out by separatists and jihadists, highlighting the growing links among armed groups in the region.
In West Africa, Al-Qaeda affiliate JNIM has demonstrated increased capacity to control key terrain in the Sahel, most notably by strangling fuel supplies around population centers. The capture of a capital city would provide Al-Qaeda with all the trappings of a nation state to sponsor global terrorism.
Despite the security concern, Anderson says there has been some progress in some counter-terror operations through military collaborations. In March, the Trump administration deployed troops and drones to support Nigerian forces.
We've also been working very closely with Nigeria, who has, in the last few months, opened up with a very positive engagement with intel sharing and ability to go after and target some of these terrorist threats that are in northern Nigeria. And so that has been a positive area that we've seen as well.
The top U.S. military leader, however, noted that intelligence gaps in several African regions are becoming a growing concern for counterterrorism efforts. He says AFRICOM's footprint across the continent has reduced by 75% over the past decade, coupled with the drawdown of allies in the region. He emphasized that expanding cooperation is critical. Sofia Shimechero, CGTN.
Somalia is in the grips of another severe drought, and agencies warn fatalities are likely to increase following the first cases recorded in February. The situation has been made worse by limited humanitarian aid as well as the rising fuel prices as a result of the Middle East conflict. CGTN's Crystal Onkeo reports.
The drought has displaced over 20,000 Somalis this year, according to UN estimates. One of them is 45-year-old Fadumo Mohammed, who fled from Lower Shabelle both because of the drought and the persistent threat of Al-Shabaab militants.
After a prolonged drought, we had hoped and prayed to Allah for rain, but it never came. The water sources we depended on for farming, including the river, dried up completely. Once the river was gone, we could no longer sustain our cattle. Rather than watching them die of thirst, we were forced to slaughter them. On top of this, ongoing conflict made our situation even worse, forcing us to flee before the fighting reached.
Food security experts warn that nearly 500,000 children may face severe acute malnutrition, the most severe form. That would be higher than the number of children requiring treatment for it during droughts in 2011 and 2022, according to UNICEF.
We have the first reported cases was on the 13th of February, where at an IDP camp in Lower Shabelle, we had 2 children who died. And the diagnosis of the death was, and I quote for you, it was severe hunger and deprivation which caused their deaths.
Livestock has not been spared. Thousands of sheep, goats, and even drought-resistant camels have died. Some pastoralist communities have seen livestock losses of up to 90%.
So the point is that, we have reached a tipping point where it's beginning to happen now. We are hoping and praying, inshallah, that the rains which we expect in the next couple of days and weeks will help to alleviate the problem. But then again, what we've seen previously, you can have drought and you can have flood at the same time in the same area.
Rising fuel prices from the war in Iran have also added to the crisis. Somalia buys most of its fuel from the Middle East, and 70% of its food is imported, a significant portion of which used to pass through the now closed Strait of Hormuz. The spike in fuel costs has caused significant inflation, pushing food prices up and making it out of reach to many. WFP says the situation has complicated its operations, forcing the aid agency to consider diversifying its supply chain to meet the growing needs, even as time slips away to save the most vulnerable. Crystal Onkeo, CGTN.
Now, close to 20 million people, or 40% of the Sudanese population, are facing acute hunger. That's according to the IPC, a UN-backed global hunger monitor. The states of North Darfur, South Darfur and South Kordofan states remain at risk of famine, where 135,000 people face catastrophic levels of hunger. Over 3 years of civil war in Sudan has left millions displaced in camps and dependent on humanitarian aid. Last year, the IPC confirmed famine conditions in the cities of El Fasher and Kadugli, largely as a result of sieges by paramilitary forces. The hunger monitor says ongoing hostilities, especially around major supply routes, and the possibility of renewed siege-like conditions continue to heighten risks. The regional Iran crisis also threatens to worsen the situation, raising food, fuel and fertilizer prices and making a successful harvest later this year less likely. To the Central African Republic, where search operations continue for victims of a recent mine collapse in the Nana Mambere prefecture in the west of the country. A local official says all activity at the Be Mbari gold mining site remains suspended. Several dozen people were reportedly killed in last week's landslide, and many bodies are still buried. The Be Mbari site is located in a remote, hard-to-reach area where several armed groups opposed to the state operate. Media outlet Radio Ndeke Luka reported the site was largely outside state control, and violations of artisanal mining regulations have contributed to recent fatal incidents. Climate change is rapidly reshaping migration patterns across West and Central Africa, with millions already displaced by floods, desertification and extreme weather events. Regional leaders, development institutions and climate experts have now gathered in Lagos to push for stronger investment in climate mobility solutions. They warn that without urgent action, displacement across the region could rise dramatically in the coming decades. CGTN's Deji Bademosi has more on the story.
From shrinking farmlands in the Sahel to coastal erosion along the Gulf of Guinea, climate change is increasingly forcing communities across West and Central Africa to move in search of survival. At this regional conference on migration and climate action hosted by the International Organization for Migration in Lagos, the experts who addressed the gathering say climate mobility is no longer a future concern, but a growing reality already reshaping economies, livelihoods and development planning across the continent.
And today, more than 2 million people in the region have already been displaced by disasters. 2 million. But beyond the numbers, we must not lose sight of what they represent. because behind these figures, there are individuals, there are communities, and there are local authorities increasingly struggling to cope, often with limited support and few alternatives. And these trends are accelerating. So without more inclusive and effective climate action, up to 32 million people in West and Central Africa could be compelled to move internally by 2050.
We must scale up climate finance. We must invest in resilient infrastructure. We must support livelihood, strengthen urban systems, and deepen regional cooperation. Without all of this, policy commitment risk remains an aspiration.
Climate finance has been a big talking point on the global stage, especially at the last UN Climate Change Conference at Belém in Brazil. Beyond making a strong case for climate finance, speakers here called for serious investment in climate mobility.
Climate mobility cannot remain and should not remain peripheral to climate and development finance. It has to be understood as a core investment issue, an issue that affects how we plan our cities, how we invest in territories under pressure, and how we support livelihoods and resilience in a changing climate. This is the transition that we need to make.
On his part, the European Union says sustainable climate mobility projects must go beyond infrastructure announcements and demonstrate long-term economic viability, institutional accountability, and measurable impact for affected communities.
We, as European Union, we see a deep need to see proper investment projects and plans, with the investors taking responsibility for the management of public goods for the long term. Whether this is a dam, whether this is a coastal area, whether this is agriculture, agroforestry that needs to be developed because of the certification concerns. If there is no economic case for that expenditure, we cannot talk of investment.
Discussions at the conference also focused on the role of data, technology, and early warning systems in responding to climate mobility. As climate shocks intensify across West and Central Africa, experts say the real test for governments will be their ability to move beyond declarations and mobilize the financing, infrastructure, and regional coordination needed to manage climate mobility sustainably. For many at the conference, the challenge is no longer whether climate-driven migration will increase, but whether the region is prepared for its consequences. Deji Bademos, CGTN, Lagos, Nigeria.
The effects of climate change are hitting vineyards in the Western Cape province of South Africa. Many wine producers say they've had to adapt or perish due to unusual weather patterns. Some are now adopting advanced data-driven scientific methods to protect their delicate fields. CGTN Sophia Shimechero with more.
The Himelanarda Valley is renowned as a relatively cool part of the Western Cape. Conditions there allow grapes to ripen slowly, preserve the natural acidity and tension required for premium wines. However, scientists say the region is slowly getting warmer, forcing farmers to push up the harvest's calendar as rising temperatures accelerate grape ripening.
Traditionally, grapes were harvested anytime from mid-January until March. Of course, in cooler regions like the Himelanarda and the coastal Cape South Coast, these grapes are harvested in March and sometimes even in April. With a shift in these phenological stages, it means that these grapes will now be harvested much earlier, and we have established that in 2035 we might even start harvesting in November.
At Creation Wines Estate, the reality of climate change drives daily operations. Winemakers are now substituting traditional farming with advanced data-driven climate science. Production here focuses on cool climate wines such as Pinot Noir and Chardonnay.
We will do things different, like planting certain cover crops. We will change our pruning systems on some of the cultivars, like the Chardonnays and the Pinot Noirs. We will go to the geo-pruning system.
Non-profit organization Vinpro provides the technical support to help vineyards navigate the direct challenges of climate change.
Our approach to navigating changing climate and building resilience into our vineyard systems is to bring in precision viticulture into our vineyard systems and our vineyard operations. And that really means starting, building the right foundation from the beginning, understanding your site, your topography, your climate, your soil types, and putting all of that information together to make the right decisions or the best decisions and the best selections to ensure that you have a vineyard that is producing for the longest time possible, a viable vineyard.
Closely monitoring and adjusting every aspect of a vineyard is how a wine estate like Creation is building climate resilience. Sofia Shimechero, CGTN.
A groundbreaking digital reconstruction of the iconic Littlefoot fossil from South Africa is offering new insights into early hominid evolution. The detailed virtual model reveals unexpected anatomical similarities with Ethiopian specimens, contributing to ongoing debates about relationships among early human ancestors across Africa. Experts say only a handful of such fossils preserve an almost complete face, making the Littlefoot skeleton a rare and valuable reference point. CGTN's Julie Shire reports.
One of the most remarkable hominin discoveries in history has been given a digital makeover. Littlefoot was discovered in Sterkfontein Caves, an area on the outskirts of Johannesburg known as the cradle of humankind for its rich fossil deposits.
Littlefoot is particularly important when we think about human evolution because it is the oldest hominin that is a human ancestor that we find in southern Africa at about 3.67 million years old. But it's also the most complete skeleton that's ever been discovered of one of the early members of these sort of hominin records, so human ancestors.
Using sophisticated scanning techniques, researchers managed to restore many of Littlefoot's facial bones, distorted by millions of years of geological pressure. The result, one of the most complete reconstructions of Australopithecus' face.
One of those amazing parts of Littlefoot is the skull. So we have not only the top part, the cranium, but we also have the mandible, the jawbone as well. And it tells us an awful lot of information.
We can also have information about how Littlefoot really managed to survive in that environment 67 million years ago. The face is like an interface between the organism and the environment. So by that I mean through the face you can, of course, if you need to find resources in your environment for eating, but you need also to breathe, you need to see with your eyes. So all of this means that it's very important for surviving and evolving.
Littlefoot also displays a striking resemblance to a limited number of homin species found in Ethiopia.
The fact that we see similarities between Eastern and Southern Africa, that means that there was a connection. We can't say really if they emerged in Eastern Africa, they migrated to South Africa, or maybe the other way around. What was surprising is that Littlefoot is not that similar to the other specimen we had from Sterkfontein, which is Mrs. Place.
While the study of Littlefoot is ongoing, the research does suggest Africa's evolutionary landscape did not occur in isolated pockets, but was far more connected and diverse than previously thought. Julie Shire, CGTN, Cape Town.
Uganda's key wildlife populations are dropping, raising fresh concerns about conservation efforts amid growing human pressure on habitats. According to the 2026 Wildlife Report, the lion population has fallen to 291 from 335 years ago, while elephant numbers dropped by nearly 300 in the same period. Isabel Nakiria reports.
These iconic tree-climbing lions are now a rare find in Queen Elizabeth National Park. It's one of only 2 places in East Africa where tree-climbing lions can be spotted. The Queen Elizabeth National Park is the most visited protected area in Uganda, and these big cats have historically been a major attraction. However, visitors are spotting them less often now, which is a serious setback for tourism revenue.
We are working towards ensuring that we protect and conserve Uganda's wildlife resources, and as such, it would be our wish. Our happiest moment is when we see wildlife numbers increasing, not when we are losing wildlife.
The gigantic elephants too have reduced in number, another key species that has driven tourism numbers for years. The decline in key wildlife species threatens long-term conservation efforts. Officials say strengthening monitoring technology like drone surveillance could help improve the sector. Wildlife habitats are severely affected, leaving the animals with no hunting ground to thrive. Human pressure on habitats for agriculture and settlement is pushing wildlife out, with poaching posing another risk to wildlife populations. Conservationists warn missing such rare spectacles in Uganda's parks will hurt the economy.
There has been some ecological modification. Some of the places which used to be open grasslands and lions can find cobs and hunt, they can no longer find those animals to eat. Reason being that some of those places have been overtaken by big bushes, big trees, to the extent that the lions cannot hunt in such spaces. So that is habitat modification.
Despite this, the country posted significant increases in other species like zebras, antelopes and cobs, highlighting a major boost for tourism.
That's why we are sharing 20% of our revenues with the communities, so that they can see the benefits of having the conservation of wildlife in their areas, so that they can feel the ownership of the wildlife, so that they know that if one animal dies, they are losing. If the visitor numbers go down, the revenue share that they get also goes down.
Despite Uganda's major wildlife species facing a hit, the country recorded 1.4 million visitors in 2024. Officials hope enhancing conservation efforts will help grow wildlife numbers and make the country a top tourism destination. Isabel Nakiria, CGTN Kampala, Uganda.
And it's time now to take a look at your business news. Here's what's ahead. Business leaders at the Africa CEO Forum call for a stronger approach in protecting Africa's interests. And a $4.5 billion hydropower project takes shape in Angola.
You don't find the stories of North Africa by sitting on the sidelines.
You've got to get out, go there, and you'll find them. In the bazaars of Casablanca. Among the crowds in Cairo.
Who come to visit Cairo, the ancient capital of Egypt.
Along the waters of the Nile. Along the sands of the Sahara. No one else will take you where we can in North Africa. No one else will show you what it's all about. CGTN, see the difference.
The Africa CEO Forum has entered its second and final day in the Rwandan capital. At least 8 African heads of state, alongside more than 2,800 business leaders, are in attendance this year. Leaders attending the forum have once again called for urgency to address intra-Africa trade barriers and unlock investment opportunities across key sectors. CGTN's Ethan Tashobia has the details.
Despite several trade frameworks already in place, shipping goods and traveling across African borders remains a major challenge for businesses. A reminder that connectivity and trade ambitions African leaders often speak about are still moving too slow. Now, once again, leaders have gathered, hoping to find a breakthrough. At the 2026 Africa CEO Forum in Kigali, business leaders say Africa can no longer afford fragmented markets, expensive financing and barriers limiting trade across the continent amid growing global economic uncertainty.
Scale will not be achieved by governments, businesses, or investors acting in isolation, but through shared responsibility, shared risk, and shared execution. This message is especially relevant today. The global economy is changing rapidly. Capital is more selective, financing is more expensive, supply chains are being reorganized, and technology is transforming every sector. At the same time, Africa's demographic opportunity is becoming impossible to ignore.
The two-day forum is bringing together government and the private sector to discuss Africa's economic future through investment and policy talks. At least 8 African heads of state, alongside more than 2,800 business leaders, investors and policymakers from over 70 countries are attending. Leaders say Africa must work more closely together, better leverage its resources and reduce dependency on external powers.
And if you look at the critical minerals that talked about, all of them, or the majority, are on the continent for making batteries and so on and so forth. And different powers are fighting over that. But Africa, that has a lot of that, is silent or losing most of it cheaply to those who have the power and have know what they want to do.
Meanwhile, Makta Diop, Managing Director of International Finance Corporation, says Africa must position itself as a major engine of global growth, not simply a supplier of raw materials.
Africa is not a frontier market waiting to be discovered. This is a defining growth story of the 21st century.
Much of the first day focused on trade bottlenecks, mobility restrictions, and what leaders describe as unfair global financing structures that continue limiting Africa's economic competitiveness. As the forum enters day 2 here in Kigali, focus is now turning from big ideas to action, from infrastructure and trade to investment deals. Leaders here say Africa needs to compete globally. The question now is whether these talks will deliver tangible results for the continent's economic transformation. Ethan Tashivia for CGTN, Kigali, Rwanda.
Well, Nigerian President Bola Tinubu is among the delegates attending that forum in Kigali. He urged leaders to put Africa first.
We need to put our money where our mouth is and develop a relationship. Luckily, we have African trade agreement that should not be left on the drawing board, should be activated properly. Regional collaboration and effective utilization of our resources. Not working in silos, but in collaboration with one another, using what we have. To me, I believe in Africa first, because I've started Nigeria first. And all resources, today, we don't want scavengers. We don't want extractors. We want people to add value. If you're an investor, we will encourage you to add value to what we have as a nation.
Ethiopia and France are deepening their diplomatic relationship following French President Emmanuel Macron's visit to Addis Ababa. His visit to Ethiopia, the third since taking office, concluded with the signing of key loan and investment agreements. The French president also met with AU and UN top leaders in Addis Ababa. Becca Atoma reports from Ethiopia's capital.
French President Emmanuel Macron was warmly welcomed at Bole International Airport early Wednesday afternoon by Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. In a post on X, Prime Minister Abiy said the French president's third visit to Addis Ababa showcases the friendship between France and Ethiopia, which grows stronger with time.
The two leaders held bilateral talks at the National Palace of Ethiopia, where they presided over the signing of key agreements, including a €54.6 million loan for a renewable energy and digitalization program, as well as an investment in a 150 megawatt geothermal energy project through a public-private partnership.
High-level visits like this one is politically very much significant. On the other side, our development trajectory has some priorities. So one of those priorities is investing on renewable energy. I think France is coming towards Ethiopian priorities. So the coming of such type of investment and development assistance is essential to further accelerate the economic growth that Ethiopia is experiencing now.
President Macron also visited Ethiopia's Science Museum alongside Prime Minister Abiy shortly before meeting with AU Commission Chairperson Mahmoud Ali Yusuf and UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres at the Africa Union headquarters. During the trilateral meeting, the leaders discussed Africa's permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council, which President Macron supported during the Africa Forward Summit in Nairobi.
Africa officially asked at least Africa deserves 2 seats in the Security Council. This is a political agenda for Africa, and don't forget, France is one of the states that has veto power within the Security Council. So it's about discussing with France, maybe in the future, to give support for African requests.
President Macron's visit to Ethiopia and the AU, which followed visits to Kenya and Egypt, is widely seen as part of France's broader effort to reset diplomatic relations with the African continent. Beka Atoma, CGTN, Addis Ababa.
And coming up in your sports news, we'll have the latest from the World Squash Championships from Egypt's Giza.
The greatest journeys, the greatest sights, the greatest adventures.
Here in Qanater, this weir allows the locals to walk on water.
We're far more than just TV news. We're your passport to the wonders